Perfect. Again, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining the Native Village of Georgetown for our mining webinar. This webinar series was organized in response to a need expressed by Native Village of Georgetown members to learn more about the impact of mining on the Kuskokwim, specifically Donlin Gold. The Native Village of Georgetown has not taken a position on Donlin Gold and is organizing this webinar series for educational purposes. We're really excited to be kicking off our first episode today, and I just have a few housekeeping items I wanted to go through before we introduce our speaker and get started. I will be facilitating today's webinar, which is recorded, and the recording should have started now. Your name and image may be displayed in the recording. To better share the information we learned, the recording will be shared publicly on our website, so just keep that in mind. You can also change your name and so on if that's something you prefer not to have. Please note that if you are joining using a phone number, then long distance charges may apply, and we're sorry about that. We are pleased to offer a safe learning space and ask for your cooperation to help ensure a safe environment. We do not tolerate harassment in any form and ask that we all work together to have a respectful dialogue. Disruptive individuals may be removed from the webinar. For our first episode, we are pleased to be joined by Olivia Glasscock, a senior associate attorney based in Earthjustice Alaska office in Juneau. Olivia hails from Alabama and has always been passionate about environmental stewardship and conservation biology. Olivia graduated from the University of Virginia School of Law, where she was the managing editor of the Virginia Environmental Law Journal. And I will let Olivia also introduce Earthjustice. Olivia will now give a short presentation, and afterwards we will have time for questions. Olivia, whenever you're ready.
All right, let me get my share screen going. All right, I hope everyone can see the screen. It looks correct on my end. So hi and welcome. As Barbara said, we'll be going through this presentation and I'll be sure to save plenty of time for questions at the end. I'm Olivia Glasscock, and I'm an attorney at Earthjustice. Earthjustice is a nonprofit environmental law firm with offices in both Juneau and Anchorage. Over the past few years, we have been working with tribes along the Yukon-Kuskokwim to raise concerns about, and at times challenges to, the Donlin Gold mine. Over this time, we've represented some 17 different tribes and a couple of conservation organizations as well. So this presentation will walk through a little bit about the mine processes and layout, and then talk a little bit about some of the projected impacts, and then finally round out with a discussion of the permitting process before we shift over to questions. So as I'm sure many of you are well aware, the Donlin Gold Project would be located in Southwest Alaska, north of the Kuskokwim River along Crooked Creek. You can see the site, where the site would be in this map, where that little red rectangle is with the words Donlin Gold Project above it. And as I'm sure many folks are aware as well, this would be about 20 miles downstream from Georgetown. So if developed, the Donlin Gold Mine would be the largest pure gold mine in the world. It would have a 27-year mine life after a couple of years of construction. And the mine would involve excavating 1.6 million tons of ore to produce just about 30 million ounces of gold. So we're talking about gold that's in microscopic quantities within the ore that needs to be processed out. So this slide shows a depiction of what the mine site would look like. This comes from the Environmental Impact Statement, which is a document created by the Army Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Land Management when they were analyzing the impacts related to the project. So this shows at the mine site, you can see that there will be three, the sort of largest aspects of the mine: the pit, the waste rock facility, and the tailing storage facility. Those are shown in orange, pink, and green respectively there. We'll talk a bit about each of those. And then we'll also talk a little bit about some of the surrounding infrastructure, which you can see some of those smaller areas on the map and the pipeline heading off to the east. So the first aspect of the mine is the open pit. This is the pit where they would actually be removing, digging into the ground to remove the ore in which the gold is contained. As you can see in the top right picture, this is a depiction of what it would look like at the Donlin Gold mine site. And the bottom right picture is an example of a roughly similar sized mine, the open pit from a roughly similar sized mine. And so the size we're talking about here, at Donlin, there would be two pits that would eventually merge. That would be about 2.2 miles by 1 mile and up to 1,800 feet deep. At closure of the mine after operations, this pit will be filled up with contaminated water, and it would form essentially a permanent lake. This lake would never meet water quality standards, and it would be required to have water treatment in perpetuity for all time to make sure that there wouldn't be contamination of surrounding water bodies. The next major component of the mine is the waste rock storage facility. This is essentially a mountain of rock. This is the facility where they would be moving all of the excess rock taken out of that pit and placing it in this mound to store it. This would involve 2.5 billion tons of waste rock, and some of that waste rock would be acid generating and need to be handled in a particular way because it poses a threat of contamination to water as well. This waste rock storage facility, the pile of rock would be up to 1,115 feet tall, which if you're familiar with very tall skyscrapers in New York, is almost as tall as the Empire State Building. And the waste rock storage pile would be about 3.9 square miles in area. So the final major component at the mine site is the tailings storage facility. Tailings are the byproduct, the sort of leftover product after they're processing the ore and getting the gold out of it. So tailings are a combination of water, crushed rock, and additives used in that processing. And it creates sort of a slurry or sludge that has to be contained. So in this case, we're talking about 412 million cubic meters of tailings spread out over an area of 3.75 square miles. I just want to note that this is 5.5 times larger than the Mount Poly facility, which some folks might be familiar with, which was a tailings facility in British Columbia, and 31 times larger than the Feijão facility in Brazil, which was also a tailings facility. Both of those tailings facilities ended up having catastrophic releases in which that slurry was released from behind the dam, which was storing it. So on that sort of same topic, the tailings here would be stored in a wet form behind a 471-foot high dam, which is about 1.5 times taller than the ConocoPhillips building in Anchorage, if you're familiar with that building. And I'll just note too that there has not been an analysis of what would be a realistic scenario of a tailings dam failure. The only existing analysis that's been made public is a failure of something really small, like a 0.5% release from the tailings dam. So this image shows an example of what could happen with a tailings dam failure. And this one is in particular from the Mount Poly Dam in British Columbia. where there was a catastrophic failure, and the tailings were released into downstream waters, causing threats to fish and the ability to fish there. And so now turning to some of the supporting infrastructure, both on and off of the main mine site, there would be a water treatment plant associated with the mine. The processing of the ore to get the gold out requires a lot of water. And the treatment plant would be averaging that water, treating that water at about 2,800 gallons per minute throughout the life of the mine. Additionally, to get all the supplies needed to the mine site, there would be a lot of additional barge traffic associated with the mine. So there would be about 122 barge trips, round trips per year on the Kuskokwim between Bethel and the port up below the mine site. And this would be compressed during a rather short 4 to 5 month season in which the river is passable. I'll also note here that the barges, there could be up to 4 barges at a time with a tug, presenting a pretty large barge train going up the river. Additionally, there would be a 316-mile natural gas pipeline originating from Cook Inlet. That pipeline is providing natural gas that would power the mine. And then lastly, there are a variety of other pieces of infrastructure, including airstrips, material sites, a road from the port up to the mine site, and some various other things. So this image shows both the water transportation corridor, so where I mentioned those barges would be coming through from Bethel up to the port below the mine site. That's reflected in blue there. Then in red, you can see in the image is the road up to the mine site and the mine site itself. And then it's pretty faint, and we'll look at it a little closer on the next slide, but the yellow off to the side there is the beginning of the pipeline. And so this is a closer look at where the pipeline route would be. As you can see along that faint yellow line, which I've added a highlight to make it a little easier to see. The pipeline originates out of Cook Inlet and travels along westward to the mine site over there at the left side of the screen, where you can see the mine site in red. And so now we'll shift to talking a little bit about some of the predicted impacts related to the Donlin mine. So one of the major ones is habitat damage. So that mine infrastructure and the mine site we are looking at takes up a lot of area, and the project would end up disturbing or destroying 6,500 acres of wetlands. Additionally, 32.7 miles of stream would be destroyed. A lot of that would be fish habitat. Additionally, there's some areas in which flow would be reduced to salmon streams and make it difficult or impossible for salmon to live or spawn in those areas. There's a lot of water required to process the ore, as I've said, and so they'll be drawing that from some of the surrounding areas, causing this dewatering in streams. And additionally, the barge and tug combination with the propeller would be damaging to smelt eggs in the Kuskokwim River and altering those habitats as well there. So these two images from the EIS show some of the salmon habitat in the vicinity of the mine. It might be a little difficult to see some of it, but if you can see that orangish, pinkish, reddish highlight area, that's the mine site off to the right there of Crooked Creek. And then in the picture on the right, where you can see it's highlighted in hot pink, that is pretty dense areas of salmon habitat. And then there's sort of a peachish color and red and yellow, which reflect increase or a decreasingly dense salmon habitat areas. So you can see there's pretty dense salmon habitat below the mine site on Crooked Creek and surrounding tributaries, as well as above the mine site. And then there's also significant habitat there within or currently within and directly out of the mine site itself. Then the image on the right shows essentially that same, sort of constructed the same way, but looking instead at juvenile salmon. So not only are salmon present in the area, this presence of juvenile salmon helps indicate that it's important for spawning as well. And then this third image shows it's not just salmon that are using Crooked Creek and its tributaries that would be affected by the mine site. There is a variety of salmon there. These studies found king, coho, silver, but there's other fish using it as well, like dolly varden, rainbow trout. As you can see, there's kind of a whole variety of fish for which that creek and tributaries are very important. Another source of predicted impacts related to the mine are those to water quality. So the mine would be located in what's known as a mercury belt. So there's a lot of naturally occurring mercury in the area. And when you start digging around in that sort of area, it releases a lot of mercury to the atmosphere, which eventually has to settle somewhere, and whether it settles in soil that goes into groundwater, making it to streams or directly into streams, there's a strong risk or likelihood of mercury contamination. And that comes from the sort of the blasting and the pit, moving around of the rocks, and all the sort of various activities that involve disturbing the mercury that's naturally occurring there. Additionally, I believe I mentioned earlier that some of the waste rock would have problems with acid generation and need to be treated specially. Well, there's also potential for arsenic to be leaching from that waste rock pile into the groundwater, causing water quality issues. Additionally, the dewatering processes I mentioned earlier, when the stream quantities are going down, when there's less water in the stream, the temperature of that water increases, which can be a problem for salmon and other aquatic life. If the stream temperatures are too high, it's difficult or impossible for them to survive there. As discussed in the earlier sections as well, there's also risk of tailings dam failure. The tailings dam is holding back that slurry of material that has a lot of toxins in it, a lot of pollutants that you wouldn't want to find downstream if there was a failure. And then lastly, there would have to be water treatment in perpetuity at that pit lake that I mentioned in the beginning. That pit lake would never be meeting water quality standards, and they would have to be both treating the water and continuously pumping it down to make sure there's not an overtopping or contamination from any sort of leak from that pit lake. And that would have to go on forever. And then a third major area in which the mine would impact is social aspects. So the mine would bring jobs. A lot of those would be during the shorter term, the 3 to 4 year construction period, with additional jobs ongoing during the operations period, during the life of the mine. But there would also be impacts to traditional and cultural practices, including hunting, fishing, and gathering. Some of the main ways in which there are threats to those practices are from the sort of constant and larger barge traffic on the Kuskokwim in the summer, interfering with the ability to move up and down the river safely. Those large barges are creating a lot of wake. Additionally, the pipeline corridor would have to be maintained. They would be burying that pipeline in the ground, but then keeping trees and other brush out of the way so they can maintain it. And having that pipeline corridor maintained that way opens up access to users who are not local in the area, which could increase competition, particularly for things like moose. And then, as touched on earlier, there would be direct damage to fish habitat, in particular for salmon and smelt. So shifting from talking about the predicted impacts, we can talk about permitting now. So for a mine of this size, there's a whole lot of permitting required, both on the federal and the state side. And I'll have a chart on the next page that shows some of the major permits involved. At this point, most of the major permits have been issued, but importantly, there are ongoing challenges to a few of them, and there are still a few more remaining. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Land Management were required to complete an environmental impact statement, which I've referred to a few times during this presentation. But that statement analyzes the impacts of the project, across the board, and it was completed in 2018. So this slide gives a little brief overview of the status of some of the major permits. And as I just mentioned, the Army Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Land Management have issued their permits. They did that shortly after the issuance of that environmental impact statement. The Alaska Department of Natural Resources has to issue several permits for mines like this. It's issued some of those, but I'll note here that the pipeline right-of-way lease is currently in litigation that we've brought on behalf of a few tribes and a conservation organization. And the dam safety certification needed from DNR has also not yet been issued. The Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation has issued some of the permits it needs to issue for the mine. And again, there I'll note that the Clean Water Act, Section 401 water quality certification is also in litigation on behalf of a tribe. And then the Alaska Department of Fish and Game has issued its Title 16 permits, which are required for activity in fish habitat. And just to put a little context for the status of the permits and what the litigation means, if we're successful in either of those two separate pieces of litigation, then the permits would be sent back to those agencies respectively, DNR and DEC. And Donlin would need to get those permits once again. So just before we transition into questions, I've got my contact information here. If anyone has questions that they're not able to ask or wants to talk offline, you're welcome to contact me. My phone's here, also my email. And then there's also a link to the Earthjustice website at which we have a feature on our work on the Kuskokwim in this project, if you would like to learn more information there as well. So now I'll just pause and hand it back to Barbara, who I think is going to kick us off for questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Olivia. Thank you for a great presentation. As Olivia mentioned, we're going to start the question and answer period of this session. If you're able to, if you could use the hands up reaction emoji. If you bring your button to the, your mouse to the bottom, you should have a little reactions button. And if you click on that, you can see a hands up. And also, yeah, type it in the chat. That's absolutely okay. I know some people are on the phone, so also I just wanted to make space for people on the phone. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them right now. You can unmute. I know it can be hard when you're on the phone. Hearing nobody on the phone, feel free to unmute later on and I'll check in again. We do have a question in the chat by Ashley Morocco Powell. In the case scenario, mine operates and expands. Is there a guarantee they'll even hire locals? I see many global case studies where recruitment of hires are brought in from elsewhere.
So I'm not sure specifically about the expansion scenario and the need for more employees. And the information I have is just from the EIS itself, in which it sounds like the plan is to hire, and I think I can go back to the slide, I think, where, well, maybe I can't. But there's some number of local hires. It sounds like they're planning to hire.
Sorry, I just muted myself. Christina Woolston asked if she'd be able to answer the local hire question. She's with Donlin Gold. Please go ahead, Christina.
Hi, Olivia. Hi, Barbara. Thanks so much for the opportunity in this space today. I apologize. I'm in a little bit of a public setting, so there may be some background noise. I apologize. Chalista and TKC, as the landowners, both surface and subsurface, have signed agreements with us, legal agreements. We're the developer, they're the owner. And part of the requirement is around local hire, shareholder hire, as well as contracting opportunities for both Chalista and TKC. So it's absolutely not just a commitment of ours, but it's also a legal priority of ours as well. We've been doing a drilling program for the last 3 years, and we've accomplished this past year about an 80%, 75 to 80% shareholder hire. We had 20 villages represented in our employee base this last year, and we're kicking off another drilling program this coming January for the 2022 season. So thank you so much for the opportunity to answer.
Perfect. Thank you, Christina. Are there any other questions? Craig in the chat said, I am wondering if Chalista has surveyed the shareholders and communities about their thoughts on mining operations.
As far as I know, that has not happened.
It's a very quiet group today. And again, if anyone on the phone has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself. *6 is the way to unmute yourself. Courtney has a question in the chat. If the mine outlasts the predicted life 27 years, will Donlin have to go through the NEPA process again or simply reapply for their current permits?
That is a good question. I believe that if they're going beyond the scope of what has already been analyzed and what's already permitted, they would need to seek new permits and probably in that process go through some sort of supplemental NEPA.
So I just got actually this question via email from someone who asked to remain anonymous. Where are the points in the EIS or related processes that, sorry, my screen just moved. Where are the points in the EIS or related processes that general public can support advocacy around environmental impacts for the communities surrounding the mine?
So during the permitting process, there are typically public comment periods before permits are issued. As I mentioned, a lot of the permits have already been issued. But I will note that, like I said, with those two pieces of litigation, if either of those pieces of litigation are successful and the permits are sent back to the agencies, then presumably there would be new public comment periods, at which point folks could weigh in that way. Tribes could request consultation, and there will be that way to participate and make opinions known. But I would say additionally, local opposition or opposition in general, if you have concerns, it is always helpful to raise those with your representatives, legislators, both on the federal and state side, because they're always looking at things like this, and there are actions that they can take if they know their constituents are concerned.
Thank you. And another question from this chat is the waste of employees at the mine part of the EIS? Recycling or reducing waste is not easy in rural Alaska.
I believe that is touched on in the EIS, but I can't say that I've looked at it recently enough to be positive about that or speak with any sort of certainty about what the plan is.
Then another question is, sorry, the chat is really active, which is great. Was Donlin be financially responsible for water treatment that might be required in perpetuity after the mining operations conclude?
So Donlin is required by law to submit what's called a reclamation plan, which involves their plan for taking care of the mine after it closes. Part of this involves putting up a cost bond to ensure that those water treatment processes and the pumping that has to go on forever and monitoring will be paid for. But in the case that Donlin is bankrupt or otherwise not able to pay, that financial responsibility falls back to the state. And the state would have to come up with a way to fund those processes up at the mine site.
And Enrique Fernandez, who is the permitting and environmental manager for Donlin Gold, also followed up and said, yes, Donlin has a financial responsibility and will be establishing a trust for that purpose. From the Kylie says, from the survey question earlier, I can't speak to any survey done to Calista shareholders specifically, but ONC conducted a survey specifically to ONC tribal members over the summer. Here's a summary article from the Delta Discovery, and she posted a link, and we'll also post that link on our website.
I have another question. This is Ashley. Thanks, Olivia and Barbara and everybody for this talk. I kind of came in at the time where you were talking about the mining disaster that happened in British Columbia, Canada. And I don't expect you to know everything about it, but that's kind of about where I came in your talk. And I was curious to know, I know it's in a different context, it's in another, country, but what did the after fact look like for the communities around that mine? What work is continuing to be done around that? Just I can just speak to saying being in Washington State that I've been seeing a lot more of Washington and British Columbia, Canada doing more oil spill, planning and stuff and getting it on the books for the state and the countries or whatever. But I just wasn't sure what actually happened after that. What would be the worst case scenario and how did the communities orient themselves around the challenge?
Yeah, so I'm certainly not an expert on that failure, but I do know that there were closures of the fisheries there for some time, orders not to drink water out of the downstream water bodies, and not to even be boiling and drinking the water. And I know that there's been a lot of work since then with reclamation and monitoring and trying to determine what the long-term impacts to the fish and other aquatic life there would be. So that's sort of a brief overview of some of the things that have gone on in that area since.
Thank you. I think that just kind of adds more to like the legal framework and then like the on the ground side of it for people when something like that happens. So I appreciate you sharing that case study. Thank you.
And Christina Woolston also had a follow-up to the ONC survey and writes in the chat, out of the 5,000 ONC tribal members, there was 300 who responded to the survey. Any other questions? And again, if you're on the phone, *6 if you want to unmute. And Damaris responds in the chat related to the ONC tribal survey that the response rate they had is near typical for surveys. And I apologize when I'm looking sideways. I'm also trying to monitor my email. There's a lot of screens happening. And Gisela says, likewise, the survey was mailed to 2,800 tribal members. And Craig, I think you have your hand up. Feel free to unmute.
Yeah, thank you, Olivia, and thank you for hosting this, Barbara. I guess I just had one quick question in regards to, in the recent years, the Kuskokwim and the Yukon, but for this instance, the Kuskokwim, we've had a fairly low return on both the Chinook and chum salmon. And in the talk today, you had mentioned about the potential for temperature rise in some of the areas surrounding the gold mine. There's been a bunch of recent studies here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and some of the communities in the region about the effects of temperature change and heat stress on salmon. I think you did mention that a little bit. And I'm wondering if any of that is taken into consideration in the EIS. And there seems to be a lot of growing concern about climate change and the potential impacts to natural resources in that area. So thank you.
Yeah, so the impacts of climate change are sort of briefly discussed in the EIS. And of course, the trends that we've seen over the last couple of years have been really apparent after the EIS came out. So the EIS came out in 2018, and these really troubling returns have been over the last couple of years in particular. The last few years obviously are not in the EIS. And I'm not a biologist, so I can't speak to exactly how those two things would interact. The temperature rises from climate change in addition to those from the mine site. But it certainly doesn't help to have additional processes in effect that are harming salmon habitat when there are things like climate change going on that are already affecting salmon as well.
Thank you, Olivia and Craig. And then another question in the chat is, what is the timeline regarding the permits that you mentioned? They're approved, but there's active litigation happening. Are there timelines we should be aware of around those?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if there's a specific timeline for the dam safety certification. I don't think we have information from DNR about when they plan to issue that. I can say for the two pieces of litigation, those are moving forward, but the exact timeline is a little uncertain about when there would be a final decision on those. But in the meantime, there hasn't been a decision from Donlin, like a go, no go, or breaking ground decision. So we're still waiting on those final permits and the litigation as well.
Thank you, Olivia. And the space is open if anyone has any questions. Again, *6 to unmute if you're on the phone.
Hey, hi, Barbara. This is Enrique Fernandez with Donlin Gold.
Oh, hi, Enrique.
I'm the permitting and environmental manager. And I just wanted to know that you know, there's a lot of interest on tailings dams, and I mean there are some examples here that Olivia Glasscock has you know, presented, and I just wanted to know that a lot of these, you know, all these dams that are provided as an examples, these are different from the design that Donlin Gold is using. And the causes that made those dams failed, those are things that could not happen with the design that Donlin Gold has, you know, for our tailings dam. So I think it's a lot more than in detail that I can go, you know, right now. But I know that I believe in January, Donlin Gold is going to have a presentation, and this is something that I can, you know, I can expand on that time and provide some graphics and try to illustrate how the Donlin Gold tailings dam is different from these other dams that failed. So I just wanted to note that. And also with regards to the comments about temperature in the water, it's something that it was noted in the EIS, but it wasn't analyzed in a quantitative way. And it's something that we actually spent a lot of time this year trying to do more analysis and study with respects to water temperature in Crooked Creek and factoring the changes in stream flow, and even looking at some of the highest temperature that we have on record with our instruments. We, you know, even using the higher temperature as a start point, we will not exceed the thresholds that are safe for salmon. So just wanted to note that that's something that I can talk about in our meeting too.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. I think a lot of people would be interested in that. And just to touch on something Enrique mentioned, we do have more webinar episodes coming up. I posted the link in the web chat. The next one, I believe, is January 12th. It's ONC. January 19th, we have a Chalista. And then January 26th, we'll have Donlin Gold in similar format to this.
Yeah, this is Dave Cannon.
Hi, Dave.
Hello. Yeah, Enrique, I was just wondering then, is it possible to get copies of the studies there that you were just talking about?
Let me see if I can, if they're okay to distribute right now. I can definitely show, you know, the results of the analysis. Okay.
Mm-hmm. All righty, thanks.
Thank you, David and Enrique. And also I see Courtney posted in the chat in previous webinars, I have heard that tailing lakes will always leak. It's just a matter of how much they will leak. Is that true? And I think that question is either for Olivia, yeah.
Yeah, so I think kind of related to that and what Enrique was saying, there are different tailings dam designs that are more and less safe, but inherently the fact of having this slurry with toxic materials in it that has to be held back by a dam forever presents a risk. We haven't had, the need for these massive tailings dams has not been around for that long. So it kind of remains to be seen how successful dams will be 100, 200, and so on years into the future. So I think that is an important question about when they will leak, because it is a risk.
Yeah.
Thank you, Olivia and Courtney. Any other questions? Gisela asked in the chat, does the EIS also provide information on what actions might need to be taken to prevent wildlife from drinking water from tailing dams?
The EIS does touch on apparently removing wildlife that are in the water on the tailings dam, or in the tailings facility, because it, does present a risk to those creatures to be consuming that water.
And I think there's a follow-up question from Damaris. Do tailing dams keep birds from swimming or landing in the dams?
I don't think that it's prevented. I don't think they're prevented from doing it. I think the plan is more physically removing them if they get in it.
And Ashley shared a link to a YouTube video, a dam disaster in Brumadinho. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, on January 25th, and says what I always think about, see in my head about tailing dams and others in the Southeast Asia. It's a disaster in Brazil. And so we have a few more minutes dedicated to this mining webinar. And so if anyone has any remaining questions, I encourage you to ask them now. You can type them in the chat, you can email me, or you can unmute yourself, *6 if you're on the phone.
Hi, Olivia. Excuse me. Hi, Barbara. This is Christina. I just wanted to say one more comment. There was made mention of the gas line, the natural gas pipeline that would be built and buried, which is correct. And as part of the EIS outreach process, there were hundreds and hundreds of meetings with feedback about the design and about the corridor. And one of the questions posed was, would the communities like open access? And we heard resoundingly no. And so the design is not to have open access. So there's already it generally speaking follows the Iditarod corridor. And so in laying that, so there will be, a construction corridor while we're installing it, but afterward that will be reclaimed and revegetated, and it will resemble roughly what you see as like a power line corridor in, I don't know, various communities. And so there won't be an open access trail to speak of. And that was by intent, because the community said they did not want open access. They didn't want people coming in to do additional hunting.
Thank you, Christina. Thanks for the follow-up. And your comment actually generated another question, two questions actually. Sorry, the chat is really active. So how does the natural gas corridor proposed since it's underground consider permafrost changes? And what happens to the pipeline after the work is done? And maybe Olivia, if you're able to address that, and Christina. Right. I'm not sure who the question was addressed to.
I think I missed what the question was in there. I'm sorry.
No, you're absolutely right. How does the natural gas corridor proposed since it's underground consider permafrost changes? And what happens to the pipeline after the work is done?
I can't say that I'm readily familiar with exactly how they're planning to deal with changes in sort of melting permafrost and changing conditions due to that along the 300 miles that the pipeline is going to be buried.
I can take that if you want. So this is Rick Fernandez with Donlin Gold. First of all, I mean, the pipeline is something that it tries to avoid. Okay, permafrost. It's something that it can be handled through the engineering of the pipeline, and you just engineer for it. But first is route selection. You try to avoid it. And then, once you determine the areas that of permafrost, you cannot have to, like I was saying before, engineer for it. First you try to avoid them, and then, there is the worst areas are the ones that they are kind of in between. Okay. Normally, if it's something that is frozen, you put the pipeline and you try to, insulate as much as possible, and then you try to keep it frozen. But in places where the pipeline and the ground is freezing and thawing, then that can generate movement on the ground. Okay, and the way you engineer for that is through thickness of the steel of the pipeline. That varies from place to place. And also through different depths of the pipeline too. Sometimes there is areas that you just excavate. If there is a little bit of permafrost, you can just excavate and remove it. But if it's more, again, you just gotta look at the different thicknesses of the pipeline and engineer for that.
Thank you. And then Dan in the chat posted an article from the Mining Journal where he says it talks about Barrick and Nova Gold CEO Mark Bristow and Greg Lang meeting with senior Alaska federal and state government officials who expressed their continued support for the project. Have state or federal government officials met with ONC or other village members?
I assume that question was directed to me. There has not been formal tribal consultation with ONC, as far as I know, from the state on this issue.
Thank you. Andrea Gusti, as the landowners, we have learned from projects all over the world. We have worked very closely with Donlin and Chalista, and I believe Andrea is with TKC, correct me if I'm wrong. We have worked very closely with Donlin and Chalista to ensure that the potential project goes above and beyond state and federal regulations. This is our land and we will be here forever. We are doing all we can to ensure that the project is safe. Donlin has been a good partner in that. I'm looking forward to being able to share the full picture on this very important issue during future Zooms. Absolutely, Andrea, thank you. We look forward to having you too. Dave mentions the title of the research, thank you, that he suggested Ben's research. He suggested a PhD dissertation, which is predicting mining company stakeholder conflict and incorporating social conditions into mining project valuations. Ashley thanked Enrique. Thanks for the extra insight on Donlin's engineering plan and processes. And, I think there would be a lot of interest during Donlin's episode if we could go into that more. And we have about 4 minutes left in this session, and I just want to be respectful of everyone's time. And so if there's any, maybe we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
I was curious about, it feels as if a lot of the things that will happen with the construction and the permanent presence of a tailing dam, all of the pollution, has the mining corporation thought about how to, it feels so awful to say it this way, but like, if the salmon, trout, and smelt, all of these fish are going to be impacted by the presence of the mine, and then the subsistence hunting, subsistence living is going to be impacted, will the people that live along the river and maybe even at the mouth of the river, how are they going to eat? Like will the mining company feed them? Like if they can't eat and feed themselves, are they going to move away? Like what's the impact for the communities along the river? Because I also know that the salmon, a lot of the fish are struggling because of climate change and for multiple reasons that we haven't figured it out yet. Like they're already threatened. So it feels like this mine is going to, there's no discussion about like hatcheries or ways for the mine to try to offset the issues that they're going to cause. And it also sounds as if they're going to build the mine and then there's going to be this all of these issues that will stay for all eternity that someone like future generations are going to have to deal with. So I know that those are like big questions, but I guess I'm just wondering how do we stay in touch and like stay informed about what's happening with the permitting and ways that we can provide our input and comments about the project.
Thank you for that. I think those are the really important questions to be asking. And as for how to stay in touch, at least for our part, my contact information is here and you're welcome to reach out at any time. And we can talk about how you might want to learn about permitting or what's going on and what work Earthjustice might be doing in the region. So yeah, feel free to reach out.
Christina?
Thank you, Barbara. Damaris, those are excellent questions, and those are questions each and every one of us have asked ourselves before we came to work for Donlin. I won't speak for anybody other than myself and for the team. We are all Alaska Native. We are born and raised in Alaska. We rely on subsistence, and our families have for generations and generations. And if it were a choice between fish and wildlife and mining, we wouldn't make that. And the reality is that we've seen projects in Alaska, like Red Dog, like Fort Knox and others, where you can have a safe and environmentally sound project and jobs and an economy, and also have a system that is protective of the environment. We would not make that choice. It is way too important for all of Alaska, our natural resources. It is heartbreaking, the challenges right now that our fisheries are experiencing. And I think the hatchery conversation is one that we're just starting to have, because we're seeing some data come out of Southeast with some of the hatcheries that they have there. And so I think there's just a lot to learn right now. And one of the things that Donlin has invested in are substantial fisheries and specifically smelt surveys on the Kuskokwim River. And we'd be happy to share that data with you as well. Some really good information that's never been gathered that we started doing about 5 years ago. And I guess, I'm sorry, we're out of time right now, Barbara, but the last thing is, you know, the financial obligation up front is to reclaim the land, including the pipeline. If people in the communities want to keep that as an asset, and that's something that we will leave in place. And we're looking at other ways to help the community with some additional infrastructure needs. But that's our job, to reclaim the land and to return it to a safe and usable existence. So thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Christina. And Courtney just shared a message in the chat. Just in case you're interested, here's a webinar that addresses some of the permafrost issues, read the natural gas pipelines, and some other health and environmental impacts, and shares a link. And again, we'll also share the link on the website. People are sharing a lot of great resources in here, and we really appreciate it. And I think we have time. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, Olivia.
I was just going to jump in with one more thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not fully up to date on exactly what the outcomes have been, but I do think it is fair to say that those mines have had water quality issues over the years. Again, I, off the top of my head, can't speak to what the extent of those have been and what the resulting impacts have been, but you know, just sort of an example of the inherent risk of this sort of project, and that inevitably there are at least water quality issues.
Thank you, Olivia. And looking at the time, I see that was 3 minutes over time, and so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. As was mentioned several times during this webinar, we have more episodes coming, and we hope you'll be able to join us. The registration will open soon on our website. And you can just, if you sign up for our newsletter on the website, we'll also make sure to keep you informed. I also wanted to thank everyone who took the time to come today and participate. This was a really interesting discussion, and I hope other people found it valuable too. Please continue sharing resources. There's a lot of questions that people have, and we're happy to share them on the website. Thank you all, and I hope to see you again at the next ones. And we'll probably have, if you're interested in watching this recording again, we'll hope to upload it by the end of today, if not tomorrow, and we can send out an email to let people know when the recording is available. Okay, thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.